One of the defining features of the Jewish people is that they, as a people, try to preserve the writings that were written by Jews over the last 3,000 years. Jews have writings going back over 3,000 years, and preserving these is important to the Jewish people. Another thing that is important to the Jewish people is to, through preserving these writings, is to preserve the language that goes back over 3,000 years. And the other defining features of the Jewish people is to try to maintain dignity and intelligence, and a sense of decency. I would say you could say these 5 things, this handful of things, are what can define the general aspects of the Jewish people: wanting to preserve their ancient writings and their language, in other words, their heritage, their cultural heritage, and maintain their dignity and decency and intelligence, to try to hold on to what they can of the past, and to try to have some kind of a grip on their own future and present. And the reason I mention this is that a lot of criticisms people make of Jewish people are a bit ridiculous. People look at the ancient writings and say, oh, well, Jews do this and Jews do that. Just look at their ancient book. Just look at their writings from 3,000 years ago and see Abraham was going to kill his son. Therefore, Jews are crazy, stupid people who kill their children. That's the kind of stupid remarks that people make. And then you look at the people who are making these remarks and ask yourself, what do their people stand for? What do their people memorialize and honor? Now, in the first place, as I said, what do the Jewish people have to hold on to from the past? For 2,000 years, they had no country. They had no place that they could say, this place is ours. This place is where my grandparents lived, and their grandparents, and their grandparents, and hundreds of years ago, I can show you that this was our home country, and this is where my ancestors lived. They couldn't say that for 2,000 years. They couldn't say, this is my castle, or this is my village. As far as places, they had no place. And as far as objects, they had only pretty much what they could carry with them. Each time they got kicked out in one place and had to live as refugees someplace else. So all they had to hold on to was their cultural artifacts. Basically, what they could carry was what they had written down. And their language. That's what they had to preserve of their identity, was their writings and their language. And people make criticisms of the ancient writings. Oh, so just because you object to something that was written 3,000 years ago, that the Jews should just discard and destroy all these old documents? Say, oh, well, we don't believe that anymore, so let's just destroy these artifacts from the past. That's absurd. And those people that are making criticisms of what's written in the Jewish writings from 3,000 years ago, and what you think you know about the cultural and religious practices of the Jewish ancestors 3,000 years ago, you're going to use that to condemn the modern Jews 3,000 years later. Take a look at what your ancestors were doing 3,000 years ago. Take a look at the practices, the barbaric practices your ancestors were doing at the time of the Jews, and compare them, if you can. For the most part, you don't have writings. Let's talk about writing in the first place. People want to criticize the Jews for wanting to preserve the ancient writings. Regardless of what's written in those ancient writings, that's what the Jews have as their heritage to hold on to and say, this belonged to some of our ancestors 3,000 years ago, and we're not going to throw it away. We want to preserve it, to preserve our cultural memory. That's what it's about. We want to preserve who we were, where we came from. That doesn't mean we have to practice all the practices that were written about 3,000 years ago. Do you practice all the practices that your ancestors engaged in 3,000 years ago? If you compare the practices of your ancestors, if you can, 3,000 years ago, to those of the Jews, you'll find, for the most part, the Jews were rebelling against what you would call barbarism. All the gross, disgusting, cruel atrocities that ancient peoples committed, particularly in Europe and the Middle East. For the most part, the Jewish religion was a rebellion against atrocities and cruelty. And where they wrote down stories about things like, for instance, Abraham making the sacrifice of Isaac, it's incredible how ignorant people, particularly Christian people, can be in their interpretation of that story. By reading that and interpreting that as, oh look, Jews are infanticidalists. Jews kill their own children. Ooh, Jews are cruel and disgusting and horrible. When the whole point of that fucking story was because human sacrifice was practiced by all the peoples around the Jews throughout the Middle East and Europe. All these fucking ancient people practiced human sacrifice, particularly killing their own children. And the whole point of the story with Abraham and Isaac, as the establishing story, the establishing mythology of the Hebrew religion, was to outlaw human sacrifice. One of the founding principles of the Hebrew religion was that human sacrifice was not only not necessary, but it wasn't going to be allowed. That was the whole point of that mythology of Abraham and Isaac.